All right, so Kelsey, I'm turning it over to you.
All right. Hello and welcome to Supported Decision Making. Will it work for my family member? My name is Kelsey Sullivan and I will be the moderator for this session. Just a few reminders: if your camera is on, we can see you. If your mic is on, we can hear you. Everyone should be muted. Please use the chat box or raise hand function for any questions you may have. The presenters will respond at the end. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and will be made available to SLN members at the conclusion of the conference. I have placed a link in the chat box for handouts, for the conference handouts. And now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Tina to kick off her session.
Hi, Kelsey, and hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm excited to be back with you for another year. I've presented at this conference before, and it's always a really nice opportunity to learn from people. So hopefully I have some good information to share with you, and I look forward to a little bit of an opportunity to dialogue and answer some questions. So we don't have a lot of time today, so I put together a framework that really focused in on the basic elements around supported decision making. So I thought, starting with the notion of what is most important to know about supported decision making would be a good place to start. So make sure that everybody is sort of thinking through the issue on the same page. So supported decision making is less of a thing and more of a process. It's really about helping people with disabilities to exercise the maximum amount of control in their life. And how they exercise that control can be very different for different people, just the same way it is for you and me. Not everybody makes every decision in their life. Some people are happy for some decisions to rely on other people to help them with those decisions. And in other places, they're really independent and they want to have that control. So that's really part of understanding and working with supported decision making, is understand it's about control, but it's about enabling people to exercise the control that's most important in their life. And the second element that's really important is making sure people get access to whatever help they need. Now, when we say help, that can be a lot of different things. It could be the help in the form of people. It could be help in the form of opportunity to practice making decisions. It could be help in the sense of learning, some skills. It could be a variety of different things. So again, it's not one thing. It's just the idea of help. And the why that's so important for people with disabilities is often people with disabilities are prevented from making decisions in their life. And then people come around the back end and say, well, they're not very good at it. And the reality is none of us were ever good at it until we got the chance to do it. So, the natural process of learning to be a better decision maker starts with us beginning to assert ourselves early on in our teen years. And then at 18, we more or less get handed the reins. And we can then choose to, exercise full control in our lives and begin the learning process in earnest, or we can decide to work, more slowly and work in partnership with other people. But typically, for the average person, they're not prevented from making those decisions. And the experience of many other people with disabilities looks very different. So we really want to make sure that regardless of where people are in their age span, or regardless of people where in their life, we're always taking the lead from them and finding ways to honor the person's wishes, because that's really what it's about. And we've said down here, even guardians, because if you really look at the fact, even people under guardianship, the standard of practice for good practice in a guardianship is to make the decision the person would make. And as long as their wishes can be known, the guardian is expected to use those wishes in the process of decision making. And as I'll talk about later, it really, the whole notion of how we include people is really the key element here. So that's where we want to start. And I thought it was also important to kind of go the opposite direction and talk about what it's not, because there's a lot of people talking about supported decision making now. And so it's really not just one thing. So it's not a new program. It's not the latest trend. It's really what people who are the best at supporting people with disabilities have been doing for a very long time. Some people do it very naturally. It's certainly not a piece of paper, although there are documents and papers that you can use to help formalize and help people recognize the legitimacy of the help that people are getting with their decision making. And we can talk about that a little bit more too. And it's certainly not something you do once. So it's not something that you make a decision. I would contrast it with guardianship. Guardianship is people often think of, they file it with the court. The guardianship is determined and then it's done. Supported decision making is kind of the opposite of that. And it's really a regular part of everyday life. So if you think about how decision making plays out in your life, that's the same way it's going to play out in the lives of people with disabilities. So sometimes they'll be making small decisions, sometimes they'll be making big decisions, but there are a multitude of decisions and decision opportunities that can be accessed day to day. The next thing I thought would be important, again, in framing this, is contrasting supported decision-making with guardianship. And this, again, is just the highlights. So, with guardianship, which most people are familiar with, the issues there is it involves going to the court. It involves the court making a decision that ultimately results in the person's rights being limited. It doesn't need to be all the rights. Sometimes it's a limited guardianship. But the decision that's made by the court is really a determination that the person can't make decisions on their own. And it's more or less a decision that they won't ever be able to. Sometimes guardianships are reversed, but it's a small number out of all the guardianships that are actually imposed. And then ultimately, how the support is provided doesn't get controlled by the person, it gets controlled by the court. So you can see with supported decision-making, the power is in the hands of the person, no rights are limited, the person gets to retain all their rights as a citizen because no determination that they lack capacity has been made, and they remain in control of all the decision-making. When we talk about this with folks, one of the things we say is, guardianship, we're not saying guardianship is bad. Many people utilize guardianship, and as I said earlier, they utilize the principles of supporting people under supported decision-making within the context of their guardianship. So, they make the most of that situation. However, it's easier to try a supported decision-making approach, and then if more support is needed, more structure is needed, or there's some sort of emergency, to go to guardianship as opposed to move to guardianship right away. Because most of the people under guardianship, again, they do have their rights limited, and the tendency of those around the person is to not include them. Even if they mean well, in general, we see people being included in less often if they're under a guardianship in critical decision making. So who can use guardianship? That's really the key element of this. Typically anybody can, unless their wishes can't be known. Many of the people I work with are attorneys. I am not. I consider myself an advocate. I've just worked with people with disabilities of all different kinds and abilities for most of my life. And so for me, unless a person's wishes can't be known, we really, have the opportunity to use supported decision-making. There may be factors in a person's life that relate to risk and limited social networks that cause us to think that guardianship may be a preferred approach. But as I said earlier, the best approach to this is to make an assumption that guardianship can be an option for people and make the effort to try and make that work before making any determination that you're going to use a more restricted or limited approach. Because once a guardianship is in place, getting it reversed is the more difficult challenge. If you're using supported decision-making and you decide to go to something more structured, that process is much easier. So just think about it in that way. If you're already under guardianship, then again, think about if the person, your sibling or the person you care about is already under guardianship, really think about the supported decision-making as just tools to help you fulfill the role if you're in that role of agent serving as guardian, or if you're one of the people around the person to assist the person to exercise as much control as possible, even under that guardianship. So how do we make a supported decision-making work, especially when there might be people around the person who question their ability because they have a disability to make decisions? Most times we're using written documents that get used all the time. There are some specific documents that relate to supported decision-making. In some states, they've passed laws, although you don't need a law to use supported decision-making. But just general things like written release of information forms or other sort of written agreements that basically say the person wants certain people to help them with decision-making can help those folks to navigate different environments. One of the places where we see people running into a lot of difficulty is within the healthcare system. A person with a disability will go into the doctor's office, and sometimes there's a presumption that they can't make a decision. So having a person with them that helps them with decision-making might make the healthcare personnel nervous. So having some sort of written form or a release of information form that basically says the person has authorized the support person who's with them to have access to their information can make the healthcare professional seem more comfortable. At the bottom of this list, though, is a really important point that I want to make. And that is that presuming simply because we know people have a disability that people can't make decisions is really discrimination. And I would call myself an advocate. And in a lot of places, the biggest thing we do, or most important thing we do, is stand by people and ensure that they're not subject to discriminatory practices. Now, again, that might be at the bank. The bank may decide that, or at the doctor's office, or at the hospital, or some other place like that, where typically two things are present. Number one, it's what I call an institution, where they have rules and ways of doing things. And so they're not necessarily typically used to having people with disabilities come in all the time. But secondly, those institutions also frequently have attorneys that advise the people who are non-attorneys on how to approach things. And institutions, as you might know, tend to try and avoid risk. And so if they're uncertain whether or not the person has the capacity to make decisions, they're likely to say they shouldn't. And so that's where some of these written documents are tools for people like a family member or an advocate like myself can use those tools in order to remind people that they have to treat people with disabilities just the same as anyone else, and that they can choose to have anyone help them just like you and I can. So if I went into a bank and I brought somebody with me, I don't think the banker would question that. I don't think they'd question my capacity. They would be talking to me. And if that person who is with me wasn't opening up the bank account, but just sitting there with me, it wouldn't be a big issue. Very often, if there's a presence of a disability, that's when people begin to get nervous because they're uncertain, right? But the bottom line is, given our Americans with Disabilities Act, they really should be just treating people with disabilities just like anyone else. And the presumption that people can make decisions and have every right to bring whoever they want to have help them with any decisions that they are making are things that are privileges or opportunities that they should have access to. Kelsey, I'm hoping you're checking the chat box. And if there are questions that you want to stop me with, you please feel free to do that, okay? As questions come up, because it's really hard for me to do both at the same time.
Well, I was about to give you your 5-minute warning.
Oh,
well,
okay. Well, are there any questions?
Yeah, we do have one in the box if you want me to
Okay.
that one.
Sure.
Have you personally seen people utilizing SDM been affected by COVID-19? I have heard of people who are their own guardians be denied assistance in the hospitals due to restrictions. And that's from Chloe.
Well, we have run into issues where people, and especially during COVID, people, obviously hospitals were limiting the number of people. If you had COVID, you went in there. And actually using the Americans with Disabilities Act, we were able to get our local hospital association to revise its guidance to say that enabling a person with a disability who is hospitalized and receiving treatment to have a support person there was a reasonable accommodation. And again, so it's a great question, and it's a great example of how you can use the Americans with Disabilities Act to say, no, this person is, does have a disability, and reasonable accommodation is something that they have every right to. And many people with disabilities, because of their communication styles, because of, other kinds of challenges, really don't do well in the hospital without somebody there to support them. And so that was a challenge, and it was something that we really were able to successfully deal with on a case in our city. So I'm based in Washington, D.C. So we didn't solve it just for one person. We tried to solve it for everybody. It's a great question. 5-minute warning. Okay. So if you come up with another question, just let me know. But the typical tools that you or I would use to give authority to somebody else to help us or to be involved in our lives are the typical tools we would use to establish those same structures for persons with disabilities. So I think, first of all, you want to try and use that. Second of all, as I said, even if it's under guardianship, the National Guardianship Association has really taken a nice stand around saying that supported decision-making is, in fact, something very reasonably to be incorporated, even within a guardianship, if the guardianship is found necessary. decision-making is a skill. I want you to have that as a takeaway. So if you're questioning whether or not somebody can make a decision, one of the things I want you to ask yourself is, what opportunities to learn how to make decisions have they had? Because that's really, in a lot of ways, what people have a problem with, is they've really not had an opportunity to even be involved in discussions about how decisions get made. And lastly, the opportunities for decision-making, the supports for decision-making really go to opportunities, information, options, and communication with the person around, potential outcomes and what support they need, and kind of what ways are best to work with them. So it's really not a fancy process. It's really fairly common sense based. It's just a matter of, we have to remember, people with disabilities are no different than we are when it comes to making decisions. And with the process of, they've got to learn in order to get better at it over time. So it's really a matter of us figuring out how best can we do that? How can we be supportive? And the last thing I just want to say is, the reason for doing it is our data over the past decade has really shown that while people often pursue guardianship because they want to protect people, people having a confidence to make their own decisions and a good, strong support network around them really correlate very strongly with self-determination. And studies have shown people with greater self-determination actually are safer and better able to resist bad things happening to them, as well as they're healthier and happier overall. So, it's really a strong and compelling argument from a data perspective that supporting people to exercise control in their lives, regardless of their current situation, really is a tool for helping people live happier, healthier, and safer lives over time. I encourage you all to go to supporteddecisionmaking.org. There's lots of information there. There's resources listed state by state. Guardianship and decision-making is governed on a local level. So you really want to find out what's happening in your state. I can talk generally about the principles, but when it comes down to figuring out and navigating for your family member, what's happening wherever they live, is going to really be the guiding force. And that's it. If there's any other questions, I can take them, but otherwise, here's my contact information and the National Resources Center's information. And we take calls all the time. People also can send us emails if you have queries and you really need to get some basic information. We're happy to help and connect people up with the information that will be most helpful for them.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tina. That was really interesting. I just wanted to let everyone know that you don't have to go anywhere. You can stay in this room for the next session. So folks will be trickling back in from the other 3 breakout rooms, but we'll get started on the next session in just a few minutes. Thank you again, Tina.
Take care.
Thanks,
Good luck.
Tina.
Bye. Thank you.
Great session.